I'm very pleased to have Pete Farley, Director of Communications for Research and Education of UC San Francisco, to give a keynote about crisis communication and how to manage the reputation of your institution.
Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak. It's an honor to speak with you today, and it was a pleasure to meet so many of you last night. And it's great that this profession we all share is flourishing globally. It's wonderful to see. Is Mary here today? Guess not. She kind of hit the nail on the head yesterday in her introductory remarks when she said that that this talk would be most of this conference is rightly focused on the things that we enjoy, that we're trained for, that we look forward to, that we feel prepared for. And this talk is focused, on the other hand, on the things that we often don't feel trained for, we don't feel prepared for, they're outside our comfort zone, yet nonetheless we're often called to deal with them. I will say, by the way, that this is about reputational risk and not about natural disasters or disasters, human-caused disasters, which is a completely different realm of crisis communications, and there's many good resources to deal with that. And I hope what I'll be able to do is give you some guidelines that will help you not just protect your institution's reputation, but do so with integrity to be effective, and do so with integrity. So I'm going to start with the bad news about bad news. There will be good news, I promise. And there is bad news about bad news in the sense that our institutions have unique vulnerabilities to reputational risk. I don't want to say that they have greater vulnerabilities than you see in the private sector or government or other arenas, but I think there are unique things about what we do. One is that they're incredibly complex. To do scientific research, to treat the sickest patients or whatever our missions are, requires immense, expensive infrastructure, educating the next generation. All the things that we do require complexity. At the same time, we tend to be decentralized in our organization. Rather than top-down hierarchical organizations, there tend to be power centers distributed around the enterprise. And some of that is because of the tradition of academic freedom and the entrepreneurial culture of science. Researchers, to do research it's a prestigious career. And researchers enjoy a fair amount of autonomy. Oftentimes their labs are power centers in themselves. They hire people, they raise money, they train people. And more importantly, we're often working at the frontiers of knowledge, areas in which ethical and societal issues are yet to be worked out completely, if they ever will be. And we have on our campuses or in our facilities, research animals, patients, human research subjects. We're running clinical trials, you name it. So some more bad news, I promise I'll get the bad news out of the way, is that these issues tend to arise with no warning. They, in the middle of the night, any time of day or night. And by the way, if there's anyone here who hasn't established an on-call system whereby a PIO can be reached at any time of day, after hours, every day of the year, it's a good thing to do, and I'm happy to tell you how ours works. It works quite well, if reluctantly. And so you often learn about these situations from the same arenas in which you'll be later responding. social media, especially these days, or from the press. And as I alluded to before, we seldom have formal training or preparation, and yet we are often pressed into service. It's other duties as assigned, as they say, and we're often called upon to address them. But when I do reach the good news, I think I'll try to make a case that many of the skills we have as science communicators are actually quite useful in these situations. So given that kind of combustible mixture I described of complexity and decentralization and the kind of academic or research culture we work in, but what can happen? Well, a lot. And the situations vary quite a bit in intensity and even in the realms they affect. Some seem quite straightforward, others can be of global proportions. So for example, in a time of increasing academic or research on private alliances, a private company that your institution has partnered with might be attracting negative attention for some reason. It may have nothing to do with what you're doing with that company, but nonetheless, you're attached to that company. This one seems like not a big deal, but it's an accident after all. And why would this be a crisis? It's a crisis, not a crisis, hopefully. Most of the things I'll be discussing are sensitive issues, and thankfully most of them do not rise to the level of crises. So this can create sensitive issues because through a public lens or through a journalist lens, the questions that immediately come up are your drivers adequately trained? What are your safety procedures? How do you schedule these people? Should that driver have been on that route, etc.? And you'll be called on sometimes, I have been, to ask that sort of question, answer that sort of question. This one, need I say more? There are journalists now whose entire beat consists of doing investigative reporting on harassment or misconduct. Likewise, for research misconduct, there are entire websites devoted to tracking that down and documenting it. Strikes, again, can affect your day-to-day operations, and when that involves treatments for patients or experiments that are potentially endangered, you're going to, and the press, we have fairly regular strikes, and the press loves to cover them, and so we're often called on to answer questions. Safety, animal welfare, lab accidents. In the age of social media, sometimes a patient's family will inadvertently breach another patient's confidentiality, take a picture and put it on Twitter. And because of that culture of academic freedom I talked about, your own researchers can criticize your institution online. And that's not something you see a lot of in the private sector, but we do see it. So in that large variety, very diverse collection of potential issues, is there anything common we can draw from that that's a useful theme? And I think it is, if there is, it's this fundamental tension between speed and deliberation. These things are countervailing forces in all of these situations, from the most straightforward to one on a global scale. And you might say to yourself, well, that sounds like my day job. That sounds like what I do every day. I get a nature paper dropped on my desk, and I have to write about it quickly, and I have to write about it fairly and accurately. So what's the difference? And I think the difference is the things I'm talking about have an emotional component, which I'll get to a bit later in more detail, but it's that emotional. I mean, as difficult as that new paper is, you never have the sense that it's going to burst into flames on your desk yet. But these feelings have that kind of, these situations have that kind of emotional charge. And I think that frames everything. So I've tried to come up with five principles that I think are useful kind of touchstones when you find yourself in these situations. And I want to stress that these principles are for interacting with news media, not social media, which I'll return to social media later in this talk. The first one seems obvious: be responsive. But it's not all that obvious, because there's a tendency to hope things blow over. There's a tendency to not want to prepare for something that may not come. It may not be anything. Why devote all that prep work? It's like preparing your Nobel materials every year. But it's important to be responsive, because Aristotle said nature abhors a vacuum. He didn't know about anaerobic bacteria, and in silence and lack of response is where rumor and speculation. You'll never gain control of a story through silence, no matter how, even if it's on the level of a shuttle bus accident. So what do? We're still on the left-hand side of that two-part scheme I put up there. Quickly establish a point of contact. It's just the most efficient thing to do. In the best circumstances, if you're lucky, the person you appoint has experience in this realm, but they'll get it if they don't. And it's important that all media inquiries go to that person, at a maximum two. It just keeps things very clean, and journalists like to have a point of contact in these situations. Second, most of the time, not always, there's an exception to every rule, but create a holding statement. And as the name implies, this is a statement that puts things on hold. It's not a complete statement. It is an acknowledgement, a recognition, and it presents a sense that I'll get back to you. So they can be very short, and I don't have one here because there's plenty of examples online of holding statements. These are not for general distribution, or NGD is the abbreviation we use. But for that first reporter, you email it to them. Anyone else who asks, you email it to them. And it just allows a little bit of time. You can begin to monitor social media sentiment. And if you're fortunate enough, as I am, to have a social media manager, that's when they come into their own. They can keep you informed, and it's their feedback to you that will shape your interactions with conventional news media. Then finally, now we're entering the deliberation side of the chart. In the background, you have been, and these are not exactly chronological. In the next slide, I'll get to how this happens, but you're creating a media statement. And a media statement does everything that a holding statement does. That is, it acknowledges, yes, something's going on. Yes, we acknowledge it. But it does more than that. It provides context for the incident. In the case of a bus accident, you present how large and incident-free your bus service is, for example, and why you have it, and what the positive aspects to it are in terms of lowering traffic congestion, for example. And I'll give you an example here of how one might be used. So this is a story this is an incident that no one ever wants to happen. And no one ever wants a story like this to be written. the background to this story is that, in fact, we knew of this incident. We discovered it. We reported it per U.S. law to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, who govern animal research in the U.S. So this was not something we had covered up. Nonetheless, a watchdog group, through an information request, received our report to the government and gave it to the reporter. And the reporter's doing her job. And I want to emphasize throughout that throughout all these interactions, reporters, it's important not to take any of this personally. They're doing their job. And you're doing yours. It's not a battle. It's more of a dance. And this reporter's doing what she's supposed to do. So we had probably given her a media statement, a holding statement earlier. And then when we were ready, we gave her a media statement. And this is the sort of thing a media statement does. So it's obviously not all here, but she quoted 2 paragraphs. And what it does is it makes clear the procedures we have in place to avoid these situations, for people to report them if they know about them. And I think most importantly, why we do this. Why do we even have animal research? And it takes what is never going to be a good story. A good reporter, and most of them are good, will not write even a negative story without your input. They want your input. And this allows you to tell a side that puts this unfortunate incident involving a single animal into a broad context. Another thing you can be preparing in the responsive realm is messaging and FAQs. These are key points that you want conveyed in any communication, even if you opt later to use a spokesperson. But they're the key points, and it's just a way to clarify your thinking about what needs to be said. A special form of these are so-called defensive Q&As, and those are in tricky situations. And it's a document made up of tricky questions. And that document has 2 benefits. In addition to, when you're done with it, you have some talking points in case someone asks a tricky question. But just creating that document sharpens your thought. It makes you think of every potential risk that could come from this. In very rare and severe situations, not that rare, but not common, you might put a trained person who's experienced with media and experienced with the issue and is well briefed. They can speak to media themselves. For stories with a so-called long tail, where you think this is going to go on for weeks, months, that it might cycle back in a year, some do, you can compose an op-ed, not for Wikipedia, and you can submit that to an influential outlet. And again, we're now firmly on the deliberative side of that chart. This is a long-term, thoughtful, comprehensive statement. So that's point 1. Point 2 is be comprehensive. And what I mean by that is make sure that your information is complete and carefully vetted. And what you never want to do is put out anything from a holding statement to a media statement that you then have to retract even a piece of. In this case, it's not like issuing a correction on a press release. In this case, once it's out there, it's out there. So make sure that it's complete and carefully checked. Get all your stakeholders at the table, virtually speaking, in most cases. And when I say experts here, I mean it very broadly. So I don't necessarily mean faculty or administration. In some cases, it is I hate to keep returning to this bus accident, but I think it's illustrative of a lot of things. You know, in that situation, when I was managing that, I was dealing with the San Francisco Police Department, our own police department, our head of transportation, and all of those people have expertise in their realms, just like you would cringe if a statement had the name of a protein wrong. They cringe if a statement gets a fact about transportation management wrong. And credibility depends on having that level of expertise at the table. And I'm not a salesman for Zoom, but I do highly recommend it. It's really a beautiful tool for assembling people. And again, this is what I meant when I said these are not chronological. So this is going back to your response, but it's jointly, you're going to be jointly forging your plan of action. There's going to be a media statement. Will there be those ancillary materials like Q&As, defensive Q&As? Will you appoint a spokesperson, et cetera? And just to return to this, make sure you obtain every approval before you execute any of this plan, or get an approval from a person who's empowered to give that approval if you can't obviously get to everyone on a quick time scale. Third, be forthright. And this is a word that I chose carefully because there's another word that's much in the air these days, which is transparency. And journalists seek transparency, always. That's their job. And it's something we aspire to. And we aspire as a public institution to forthrightness ourselves. But in many sensitive issues, there are laws, regulations, disciplinary proceedings, litigation, investigations that preclude you from saying everything. In fact, those same constraints often mean there are aspects of the case at hand that you don't know yourself. And journalists are skeptical of that, and they'll press you on that. And there was only one journalist hand the other day, but if there is a journalist in the room, I would implore you to, when a PIO says, I can't comment on that because it's a privacy issue, give us a break, because we mean that. So my advice is to say what you can say and say what you can't say. All of these communications, remember, are often taking place with reporters with whom you've built relationships doing science communication. And they will take everything you say based on that relationship. If you say what you can say and say what you can't say, most journalists will accept that. They won't be happy about it, but if they know you and work with you, and if they understand that it's to protect privacy, protect due process, they'll work with you. Sometimes, extremely rarely, it's best to engage directly with media, and by that I mean not through statements, not through appointed spokespeople. Those situations are very rare, and so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them here, but if anybody wanted to chat about what a particular application of that might be later, I'm happy to do that. So there's three. Fourth is be resilient. And the reason for this is not only that are these things physically and emotionally demanding, and a lot of that stems from the fact that we're loyal to our institutions. Sometimes we know people personally who are being disparaged in the press. It's difficult. It can occupy many hours of your time, days, sometimes weeks. And as we all know, your regular job does not stop. So this emotional component is compounded by the fact that there's often what I call asymmetry in press coverage of sensitive topics or crises. That is, people who make complaints, accusations, who do investigations, often receive, and often for good reason, benefit of the doubt from the press that is not granted to us. We're just an impersonal institution. And going back to transparency, it's compounded when there are things you cannot talk about. And there's nothing more frustrating than negative coverage where you know you can present a better story, but your hands are tied. So it requires emotional resilience. So take care of yourself. Finally, and it might seem odd that this is last. Why is being proactive last? Well, it's last because it's often what we don't do. It's so easy to enter into a crisis, deal with it, and when it's over, where's that Nature paper, right? And I feel like at UCSF, we have, I think, very robust systems for dealing with crises and sensitive issues, but nonetheless, we have, in the last several months, embarked on a new effort to systematize this, to think about it outside the heat of the moment, come up with procedures that are perhaps better than what we do now. And I can give you a couple of examples. I mean, one other thing a lot of us never do. Remember that if a reporter only hears about your animal program when they get a press release from a watchdog operation, well, that's their whole conception of what you do. But if you get a very high rating from an accrediting organization of your research animal program, post it. If you're doing work on diversity or ethics or equity, post it. Have something you can even point to and link to in your media statement. This doesn't solve every problem, but it at least puts something out there in the air aside from what you're responding to. Second, identify your institutional points of risk. And those are, with a little thought, they emerge pretty quickly. In our world, they're IT. They are safety issues, whether it's patient safety or lab safety, any misconduct issue, whether it's financial, sexual misconduct, research misconduct, animal research. These are areas that are points of risk. And create teams of people who are experts and people with a need to know, and create templates for the materials and maybe identify new skilled spokespeople and train them. These are the sorts of things we don't attend to in the heat of the moment. So I mentioned that everything I was talking about is about working with conventional media or news media. Social media is a different animal. And the reason for that is that on that two-part chart, social media lives on the speed end completely. There's no deliberation. There's no long-term thinking happening on social. It's just... So, interestingly, it's almost a mirror image of everything I've said so far. Social media is not my expertise, so I'm fortunate to have Arzu Sarvastani work with me, and she formulates it this way, that 75% of crisis management on social media is listening. 20% is preparation for risks known and potential. And only 5% is actual response. The second part, what she means by that is she goes to public affairs, she goes to government relations, and vice versa, and just has a picture of the event horizon, you know, what's going to happen, and is prepared. So here's some principles for social. First, invest in monitoring software. And it's important to note that when people are bad-mouthing you on social, they rarely take the time to actually tag you with an official tag. So you need to have a person, again, if you're fortunate enough to have a social media manager, a person who has a good sense of the keywords that'll capture this situation. And because social is a, what's the word, sort of a cacophony a lot of the time, at first glance you may think you understand what aspect of the problem people are upset about and venting about, but often you don't want to be responding in your other channel, in the news media, to the wrong issue. You want to know get a sense by listening of what is the real issue here. There's always negative sentiment on social, and seriously, as much good stuff as social media managers are exposed to every day, they deal with a lot of negativity. Buy them a beer. And also, among these people talking, watch for any influencers, and by that I mean in this context, any people who do have a reasonable chance of affecting your work on any of your core missions. And when you see that person, that's when you know you have something you need to respond to. Try to take the issue away from social media. If you have an unhappy patient who's on Twitter, work with your patient relations department or get them to follow and DM you, get a phone number or an email, work with them outside the social media realm. Nothing will be solved there. It's just not built for that. So these are some options for monitoring, and in the bargain, a lot of these do complete social media management, so they're great tools in general, but they happen to be particularly strong for monitoring keywords. What about that 5%? What about the ones where you feel you have to respond? When your monitoring shows that a conversation is not tapering off, negative sentiment is spiking up, you may need to respond. And again, do this with great care. Do it with the utmost deliberation. The main aim, really, even if you respond on social, is to assure people they have been heard. It's not a place to present things like a media statement. Describe steps you're taking to address the issue, but only if you can be honest about that and forthright about it. It will just backfire. For very serious and continuing situations, and these, again, are thankfully rare. I doubt any of us have experienced them, or I hope you have not. There have been universities that have in the US, and in some cases they have created a defined space on their official feeds where people can express their grievances. And this does two things. It's a relief valve for this situation, but it also gives you a confined place to take the temperature and see how sentiment might be changing, you hope, for the better. So here's the good news, I told you. We have a lot of skills that are useful in these situations. We can think and write clearly under time pressure. This one I think is even more important. I think of science writing sometimes as it's like taking a planetary lander. You know, when you have to write about some subdiscipline of a subdiscipline, you drop down onto that planet, you scope out the landscape, you learn the concerns and the terminology and the methods, and you write something up quickly to the point that I look at some things I wrote 3 or 4 years ago and I say, how did I write that? That's a great skill. Because it happens here, right? Not to go to the shuttle bus again, but it's true. I have to talk to a transportation manager at 3:30 in the morning and understand how his scheduling works. We do that in science writing all the time. And I think that can be profitably applied. We have some of the deepest and broadest institutional knowledge of anyone in our organizations. We speak to everyone, from staff to graduate students, to postdocs, to PIs, to leadership. And we know a lot about how research is done, how it's conducted, how the place works. So some more good news. we're fortunate to work in this area because science and medicine enjoy very high levels of public trust. In the US, the Pew Research Center has tracked this regularly, and they find that medical scientists and scientists have the exact terminology is a great deal of confidence in people who do this work. At the National Opinion Research Center at University of Chicago, they've been tracking this for decades. And these are slightly different numbers because the questions are slightly different, but that red plot shows you that it's remarkably stable. And there's even a bit of an uptrend. And that is very good news. A recent survey in Japan by 3M showed something similar, and in fact, these are remarkable numbers, that if someone hears something from someone who works in science, 76% replied that they are inclined to believe it. And similarly, 80% of these respondents said that they are optimistic about what the fruits of science will be in the next 2 decades. That is pure gold for those of us who work in this area, because you can think of that goodwill in the public as a buffer, as a reserve. Your institution's reputation is in there, and it can be drawn on occasionally in a crisis. But there's less likely to be irreparable harm just because of that background of goodwill. I want to thank colleagues and mentors at UCSF who have all, in one way or another, taught me a lot of what I know about this, and I'm grateful to them. That's it, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Pete. So we have about 10 minutes for questions. If you have any questions, please raise your hand. We will bring a microphone to you. And at this time, we can also accept questions in Japanese, so feel free to ask in Japanese.
Thank you. I could use that.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. It was really, really interesting to listen to. I had a question. What really struck me the most was that as a press officer, I invest a lot of my time into building relationships with the journalists who write about our scientists and our institute a lot. Mm-hmm. What I have found very difficult when something happens is that we get a wave of new journalists who I have never met before, suddenly calling me and emailing me, asking me questions. And I'm pretty sure that you've encountered that before as well. I was wondering, what are maybe one or what are the two things that you try to keep in mind that you think are most important in making sure that the journalist gets the right message, that the journalist doesn't go off and write something completely different? What are the one or two things that you are most careful about when working with new journalists?
Yeah, it's a difficult problem when a general assignment reporter is put on these cases because they just don't have the context, and I think a media statement can do a lot to give them that. I don't think there's an easy solution to that problem, frankly. In terms of the barrage of things, I don't think there's much choice but to triage them, reply to the people most important to your mission first, but definitely reply to everyone. But that problem that you've noted, I mean, it's parallel to the problem we have in science communication when a general assignment reporter is assigned to write about molecular biology. I I frankly don't know if I have a good tip other than to make sure you respond quickly, and hope for the best. I mean, the fact of the matter is most of these problems don't get solved, but they are stabilized. And I think that's what we have to aspire to. I hope that's helpful. I didn't mean to evade the question.
Thank you for your talk. I would like to know what the UCSF communication apparatus looks like. How many people do you have, and like what's their varying experiences where they're coming from?
The whole communications are just public affairs and media relations?
Sounds like a pretty big group. So let's media relations and the science communicators.
Yeah. We have, aside from the leadership of the department, we have 3 communicators on the basic research side and 3 on the clinical side, because we have a pretty large clinical enterprise as well. And a lot of crises come up in that realm. So there's about 6 people, but it's really all hands on deck in many of these situations, and leadership get involved as well. But in our public affairs, that's the basic sort of division between basic research and clinical. Does that help?
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. As a PIO, I fully understand that the importance of be responsive and be proactive and everything. But how do we have to do if the decision makers of our institution, the executives, are very protective and they don't really want to, deal with media?
You doing your job with media. Yeah. That's difficult because, as I said, non-response is taken as a response by media, and rightly so. They're under deadline, and they have to report a story. I think it's a matter of education, frankly. What do they call that? Managing up. I think it's a matter of really letting people know what the stakes are in a non-response and trying to cajole them into seeing. It feels, to walk out to that cliff, it's understandable. We have not, and we have done media training, but we have not had to do a lot of work to convince our leadership that responding is necessary. I think we certainly do media training if any of them want to be spokespeople, but the general concept of response, we're lucky that it's accepted. But if you want to email me, I can give some more thought to that. I'll give you my card.
I'm really sorry, but we were sort of pushing for time and we cannot accept any more questions. I'm really sorry. There's coffee break. He's around the whole day. Please catch him and please join me in giving Pete a round of applause. Thank you, Pete.
Thank you. Thank you.